All right, so let's get into it. Today, we're going to be taking a deep dive into some fascinating research on how anxiety and apathy impact decision-making.
Yeah, this study really caught my eye. It's from the University of Minnesota.
Oh, cool. I haven't seen that one yet.
Yeah, and they had over 1,000 participants. It's a really robust study.
Wow, 1,000 participants. That's impressive. Okay, so what exactly were they looking at?
Well, the researchers were interested in how our emotional states like anxiety or apathy actually shape the way we make decisions. You know how sometimes when you're faced with a big decision, you just freeze up?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Like when you're trying to choose between two job offers and you just feel stuck,
Right, exactly. Or even something smaller, like trying to decide what to eat for dinner.
especially when there are too many options.
Totally. So the researchers wanted to understand why some people seem to dive headfirst into decision-making while others get paralyzed by uncertainty.
Okay, so how do they go about studying this? It sounds like it would be pretty tricky to measure.
Yeah, it definitely is. And that's what makes this study so interesting. They used a combination of behavioral experiments and computational modeling to really get a detailed look at how anxiety and apathy influence our choices.
Okay, so they didn't just ask people, how anxious are you? They actually put them in situations where they had to make decisions and observed how they reacted.
Exactly. And one key things they found is that people who are prone to anxiety tend to perceive the world as highly volatile.
Volatile. What do you mean by that?
It means they see the world as a place where things are constantly changing and unpredictable, like it's hard to predict what's going to happen
Oh,
next.
so it's like that feeling of what if all the time. Always on edge, wondering what's going to go wrong.
Yeah, exactly. And you might think that this sense of volatility would make people less likely to make decisions because they're so worried about the potential downsides.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
If you're constantly afraid of making the wrong choice, you might just avoid making any choice at all, right?
You'd think so. But actually, the study found the opposite. Anxious individuals actually tend to explore more options, especially after experiencing a setback.
Really? So it's like that feeling of, I need to do something, anything to regain control.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to outmaneuver that volatile environment by being extra thorough, making sure they're considering every possibility.
Wow, that's really interesting. So how does this compare to people who are more on the apathetic side?
Well, apathetic individuals tend to have a completely different perspective. They see the world as being governed by randomness.
Randomness. So like, it doesn't matter what they do, the outcome is going to be the same.
Pretty much. They don't see a strong connection between their actions and the results they get.
So I guess in that case, why bother putting in a lot of effort if it feels like it's all just down to chance?
Exactly. And this difference in perception, this volatility versus randomness, is key to understanding why anxiety and apathy can lead to such different approaches to decision making.
Okay, so we've got these two contrasting worldviews. Anxiety sees volatility and tries to control it, while apathy sees randomness and kind of just accepts it.
Right. And those perceptions have a huge impact on how we approach decision making in all areas of our lives.
This is already making me rethink how I approach decisions when I'm feeling stressed or uncertain.
Mm-hmm.
I never really considered that my emotions might be tied to how I'm perceiving the world at that moment.
It's a powerful insight, isn't it? And what's even more fascinating is that this isn't just about big life decisions. It applies to everyday choices as well.
Like what? Give me an example.
Well, think about something as simple as choosing what to have for dinner. If you're feeling anxious, you might spend hours researching different recipes and comparing ingredients because you want to make sure you're making the absolute best choice.
Oh my gosh, that's totally me. I get so overwhelmed by all the options.
Whereas if you're feeling apathetic, you might just grab whatever's easiest or most familiar because you don't feel like it really matters anyway.
That's interesting. I never thought about it that way before. But it makes sense now that you mention it. So how did the researchers actually figure all of this out?
Well, they used this really clever experimental setup called the Restless Three-Armed Bandit task.
The what? That sounds intriguing. Tell me more about that.
It's kind of like a game where participants have to choose between different options, but the payoffs for each option are constantly changing.
Okay, so it's like trying to figure out which slot machine is going to give you the best payout, but the odds are always shifting.
Exactly. And this unpredictable environment really forces people to think on their feet and adapt their strategies as they go.
I could see how that would be a good way to study how people handle uncertainty. So how did the anxious and apathetic participants perform in this task?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. So in this task, they had these three options like slot machines. And the participants had to figure out which one was giving the best payouts. But the thing is, the payouts kept changing.
So it's like a moving target.
Yeah.
They could never be sure which one was the best option.
Exactly. And that's what makes it such a good analogy for real life decision making, right? Things are always changing and we have to be able to adapt.
Absolutely.
Mm.
So what did they find? How did the anxious participants approach this task?
Well, because they're so attuned to volatility, remember, they see the world as constantly changing. They were much more likely to keep switching between the slot machines, even when they found one that seemed to be paying off.
So they couldn't quite settle on one option? They were always worried that they were missing out on something better?
Yeah, it's like they couldn't trust that any one option would stay good for long. They had to keep exploring just in case.
Okay, that makes sense given their worldview.
Yeah.
But what about the apathetic participants? Did they just stick with one machine the whole time?
Not necessarily. They did switch less frequently overall, but the interesting thing is their switching patterns seemed more random, less connected to the actual payouts.
So it wasn't even about trying to maximize their rewards. It was more like they were just picking options at random without really considering the consequences.
Yeah, it really highlights that difference in perception, right? For the anxious participants, it's all about trying to control a volatile environment. While for the apathetic participants, it's more like accepting that outcomes are largely determined by chance.
It's like they've given up on trying to influence the outcome because they don't believe they have the power to do so.
Exactly. And this has some pretty interesting implications for how we understand and treat conditions like anxiety and depression.
Okay, now that's something I definitely want to delve into a bit deeper. But before we get there, I'm curious about the computational models you mentioned earlier. Can you tell me a bit more about how they use those to analyze the data?
Sure, so they use two main types of models, latent state models and process models.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but I'm not totally clear on what they mean. Can you break them down for me?
Of course. So latent state models are all about trying to identify the hidden mental states that are driving our behavior.
In mental states, like what kind of things?
Things like anxiety, apathy, motivation. These are things that we can't directly observe, but we can infer them based on how people behave.
So in this case, they're using these models to estimate each participant's level of anxiety or apathy based on how they interacted with the slot machines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a way to get beyond self-reported feelings and get a more objective measure of what's going on inside people's heads.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
And what about the process models? What do those tell us?
Process models are more about mapping out the step-by-step mental processes that people go through when they're making a decision.
So it's like creating a flowchart of the brain, showing how information comes in, gets processed, and ultimately leads to a choice.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And by using both types of models, the researchers could get a much more complete picture of how anxiety and apathy influence decision-making at multiple levels.
So it's not just about the emotions themselves. It's also about how those emotions shake the way we think and process information.
Precisely. And one of the key insights from this study is that the ratio of perceived volatility to randomness directly influences how much someone explores new options, especially after experiencing a setback.
Okay, wait. I remember you mentioning that ratio earlier. It's like a sliding scale, right?
Yeah.
With volatility on one end and randomness on the other.
Exactly. And where you fall on that scale has a huge impact on how you approach decision making.
So someone who perceives a lot of volatility is going to be more likely to keep exploring even after a setback because they believe that things can change at any moment.
Right. They're not going to let one failure stop them. They're going to keep trying different things until they find something that works.
Whereas someone who perceives a lot of randomness might just give up after a setback because they don't believe that their efforts are going to make a difference.
Exactly. They might think, why bother if the outcome is just going to be random anyway?
Wow. This is really making me rethink how I approach decision making. I never realized how much my underlying beliefs about the world were influencing my choices.
It's a really important insight, and it has some pretty significant implications for how we understand and treat conditions like anxiety and apathy.
Okay, so let's talk about that. How can this research be applied in a clinical setting?
Well, it suggests that therapies shouldn't be one size fits all. They should be tailored to address a patient's specific perception of uncertainty.
So if someone is struggling with anxiety, we might focus on helping them manage their perception of volatility.
Right. We might teach them techniques for coping with uncertainty and challenge their negative thoughts about the future.
And if someone is struggling with apathy, we might focus on helping them increase their sense of agency and control over outcomes.
Exactly. We might help them identify areas where they can make a difference and encourage them to take action, even if they don't feel like it's going to change anything.
So it's all about helping people find a more balanced perspective on uncertainty, whether they're leaning too far towards volatility or randomness.
Precisely. And the good news is that even small shifts in perception can have a big impact on our well-being and our ability to make good decisions.
This is really fascinating stuff. I'm so glad we took the time to deep dive into this research. As we've been talking, I've been thinking a lot about the whole concept of apathy. It's often seen as a negative trait, but I'm starting to wonder if it might actually be adaptive in some situations.
Oh, that's a really interesting thought. I'd love to hear more about that. Well, yeah, I mean, think about it in a really stressful or unpredictable environment. A little bit of apathy might actually help you conserve energy and avoid burnout.
That's true. If you're constantly worrying about every little thing, you're going to exhaust yourself pretty quickly.
Right, and sometimes it's better to just let go of the need to control everything and accept that some things are just outside of our control.
So it's like finding that sweet spot between being proactive and being passive, knowing when to push and when to surrender.
Exactly. It's all about balance, and that balance is going to be different for everyone depending on their personality, their environment, and the specific situation they're facing.
This is making me rethink how I view apathy in general. Instead of seeing it as a purely negative trait, maybe it's more like a coping mechanism, a way of protecting ourselves from feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to remember. We tend to judge apathy pretty harshly, but it might actually be serving a purpose for the individual.
That's a good reminder to be more understanding and compassionate towards people who might seem apathetic. We don't always know what's going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. And instead of trying to force them to be more engaged or motivated, maybe we should focus on understanding their perspective and helping them find ways to cope with the challenges they're facing.
So it's about meeting people where they are and offering support rather than judgment.
Exactly. And that applies to ourselves as well. If we're feeling apathetic, it's important to be kind to ourselves and try to understand what's driving that feeling.
Instead of beating ourselves up for not being more productive or motivated, we should ask ourselves, what's making us feel this way? And what can we do to shift our perspective?
Maybe it's a sign that we need to take a break or reevaluate our goals. Or maybe it's a signal that we need to address some underlying issues that are making us feel disconnected or powerless.
It's like a check engine light in our emotional dashboard telling us that something needs attention.
I like that analogy. And just like with the check engine light, we shouldn't ignore it. We should take it as a cue to investigate what's going on and take steps to get things back on track.
This has been such an eye-opening conversation. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how my emotions and my perceptions of the world influence my decision-making.
Me too. And I hope our listeners are feeling the same way. This research really highlights the importance of self-awareness.
Being able to recognize how our emotions are shaping our thoughts and behaviors is crucial for making conscious and intentional choices.
Exactly. And it's not always easy to do, especially when we're in the midst of a stressful situation or feeling overwhelmed by our emotions.
But the more we practice, the better we get at it, and the more control we have over our own lives.
And that's really what it's all about, isn't it? Empowering ourselves to live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive into the world of anxiety, apathy, and decision-making. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure. I always enjoy these conversations.
And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this journey of exploration. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the fascinating world of human behavior. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep growing.